Hello everyone, and thank you for joining Chat Physics again for another author Q&A. Today we have Adam Boxer. Adam is Head of Science at Totteridge Academy and co-founder of Carousel Learning, which you've probably all heard a lot about, and if you haven't started using it already, highly recommend that you do. Adam, how are you today?
I am doing okay, thank you for asking. I'm doing all right.
Good. It's so nice to have you. I can't imagine all the things you get asked to do, so blessing us with your presence is very much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Always an honor.
Oh, that's really kind. So let's talk a little bit about your book. You wrote Teaching Secondary Science, and really about it being a complete guide to people sort of delivering really high quality teaching. What I really liked about your introduction is how you were really honest about the sort of social constructivism approach and how it's something that you bought into. And I think I'm right in saying that 5 to 10 years ago, it really was the peak of what we considered to be good teaching. So how did you feel when it was first sort of debunked, when you read that Sutton Trust report?
Yeah, so just to kind of flesh that out a little bit. So I read this line in the Sutton Trust report where it was a 2014, I think, if I remember correctly. The paper was published, and I read it shortly after. I don't remember when. And it's basically a roundup of, I think it's called What Makes Great Teaching. And it's a roundup of the evidence, and they've got a few things that they say is excellent practice, and they also have a few things which they go out their way to say is nonsense or is bad practice or ineffective at best. And I'm reading through this list, and there's I was a big teaching nerd, and there were a few that I already knew about. So there was stuff like catering to learning styles. I said that's a nonsense, and I said, oh, I know that one. And there was I can't remember. Oh, there was one about, if I remember correctly, there was one about rewards, over rewarding students for meeting like base level expectations. I can't quite remember. But then there was another one. It was literally just like one line. It was like letting students discover stuff for themselves. And I was like, well, hang on. Like that's what I do. I do a lot of that, a lot of inquiry-based learning, a lot of project-based learning, a lot of discovery learning. I like strongly believed that a definition that students had crafted for themselves was more memorable or more sticky than one that they had been given by me. So I tried to hold back from giving them stuff, and I tried to get it out with this jazzy questioning. The type it takes like 20 minutes of, that's almost it, but can someone take those 4 words and like reorder them a little bit? I'm gonna even write the 4 words on the board, just need to that kind of stuff. And the thing is that like there's now a lot of people online who say that never happened. It just wasn't a thing. Nobody ever believed that.
We've seen the discussions,
and like I used to get involved in discussions like that, but to be honest, I just find them boring now, because the people who I think the people who believe that are incapable of self-reflection, and I think the issue is that if you were one of the people who was a what's the word, like if you had a voice, some authority in those days, either you were saying the things that I believed, or you weren't saying those things, and you weren't saying anything, because there was no opposition. It didn't exist. Right? I read the tests every single week, cover to cover. I didn't buy it. My father-in-law bought it, and I got it off him. I read it cover to cover every single week. Again, this was before kids. I used to read it, for 10, 15 minutes in the morning before I headed off to school. And there was never any critique, never any pushback on the kind of dominant ideas, the things that I was raised in. So, these people, like, they're living in La La Land, right? So the first thing is, it did happen, and secondly, even if it didn't happen, it still happened to me. Yeah, no one's going to be able to turn around and say, no, you didn't believe that, because I did. I really, really did. And it would obviously just be ridiculous for somebody to say to me that I didn't believe that. I did believe it. It's what I was told during my PGC, and the various schools that I was mentored in from the various mentors. When you do a traditional PGC, like it's not like one teacher you're attached to. It's like 7 or 8 different teachers across the course of the year, plus your uni mentor, plus the external assessor, And then I worked in another school in my following year.
Mm-hmm.
So like I was getting feedback from lots and lots of different people, and all of it was positive. Yeah, all of it was, this is a really cool idea. Well done, Jazzy Adam.
Yeah.
And like all of it was just a nonsense. And it wasn't easy for me realizing that I'd been horribly and catastrophically wrong, because obviously there are like feelings of guilt, and feel
Yeah.
like you let those kids down. Like, how much time do
Mm-hmm.
you waste?
Yeah.
But like, whatever, you get over it. It is what it is. I don't know if blaming people is probably the wrong. Like, it's like 8 years ago. Yeah, playing the blame game
Yeah.
is
Easily. Yeah.
is probably not a good use of time. The important thing is to learn from it. And I've learned how to be a better teacher. I've learned how to be more reflective. I've learned how to critique my own practice and question my own assumptions. And I've learned how to, and that message of, like, one of the things that really annoyed me about it was how much of like I spent most of my time in school telling kids that like evidence is important, research is important, and to be
Yeah.
critical, and to be like mini Ben Goldacres waffling about bad science and stuff. And then it's just a lens that I was just not applying to my teaching at all,
Yeah.
which was
Do you
obviously
do you feel
problematic.
like a lot of that maybe came through the obviously there's the PGCE or various other routes. Do you think a lot of it came through that? Because I always found that while they were telling us to do one thing, they were delivering it in a way that completely contradicted what they said worked. And that's what I felt all the way through my training year. So do you think it came a little bit from there?
I don't know. I just lapped it all up. I just lapped it all up, all of it. I just took it. I just assumed and
It
took
was
it as
right.
gospel. And I just wasn't reflective or critical about it at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's on me. It's part of the human psyche as well, that we're not good at bringing critical faculties to bear on areas that we don't know a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
And we are seduced by authority. It's just a normal part of being human. But yeah, obviously, for me, it expressed itself in a problematic sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I said, it wasn't easy, realizing that about myself and my practice, but it's a long time ago, and I feel like I've moved past it now.
Yeah. And probably made up for it as well, certainly with moving forward.
Look, you try and do what you can, but obviously those kids who were in my class, they were still there. I've not
Yeah.
rectified. I've not gone back and retaught them GCSE.
Yeah. Sadly. Yeah.
But look, it is what it is. There's in the grand scheme of things, no huge harm done.
Absolutely. And I think people looking to develop, looking to move forward, rather than, I think it's so easy when you've been so swayed by an idea where you've really bought into it, you kind of want to hang on to it, you kind of want to keep supporting it. It can be really difficult to make that move. So I think advice for people would literally be to do some good reading, keep moving forward, and just let go of those things that it's generally agreed, or it's generally sort of evidence across the board that things are just not very high quality teaching. They just need to be let go a little bit. So I think developing forwards, that's the kind of idea we need to push instead of people holding on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's easier said than done. And I think what you were talking about a bit earlier when you said once people have committed to something, there's something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is used in economics, which is where if you've spent a lot of money on something, if it's going south quickly, you still hold on to it because you're like, oh, well, I've spent all this money on it. People try and salvage relationships, for example, because of how much time they've spent on it, when it might be easier to just sever it. And it's funny because this does play itself out in education quite a lot.
Yeah,
Like,
so
for
true.
example, at Carousel, we've just launched multiple choice questioning. And something that I found interesting from the research is, because what I'm doing is I'm looking at the difference between multiple choice questioning and short answer. So, if you say, give me a word equation for photosynthesis, either just giving blank space and letting someone write the answer, or giving 4 options of different equations that all could be photosynthesis. And something that if someone doesn't know the answer, when they do short answer, they just leave it blank and move on. But if someone doesn't know and it's multiple choice, they click one that's wrong, and they're like committing to something that's wrong. And it's not, it can actually be more detrimental, because you're not just getting it wrong, but you have become like a flag waver for the thing that is wrong. It's like become a part of you almost. And I think that expresses itself the whole time, that You know, when you first get questioned about something that you do, and I'm still like this, it's still really difficult because it's part of being normal and human. Like, it's your first response is always to take it personally. Someone's like, why do you question in this way? And it's like hard to like dispassionately really self-critique. It's a lot easier to comment on the work of others. But yeah, so it's not a straightforward thing, and I think I tried really hard in the book that it's not a polemic. So I tried really hard to hit a kind of dispassionate tone, and to not dump on other people's ideas.
Yeah.
So whereas I think there's only a couple of occasions in the book where I say that I think X, Y, or Z is not a good idea. And instead, I try and focus on the things that I think are good ideas.
Yeah, definitely.
Because when you're face to face with someone, it's a lot easier to have that conversation and to be constructive when you're critiquing someone. But when you're doing it through the medium of a book, you can just end up coming across as polemical, and that's not what I wanted to do.
Absolutely. I think what worked really well in the book is that rather than say, oh, this is a bad idea, this is a good idea, you had plenty of examples that shows how the improvement looks. And if you're showing people how the improvement looks, how it can be interpreted, and really digging out the differences, which I think in some cases you've sort of suggested they can look very similar, but when you actually pick it apart, you can see the discrepancies between the two different ways of doing things based on whatever sort of like teaching concept it is you just talked about. And I think those examples work really well because it gives somebody a way to kind of hang that concept, maybe compare to what they do moving forward. So yeah, that was I think that's a brilliant way of coming up against those ideas, and rather than saying this is a terrible idea, saying this is how it could look better in this context. And I think those bits you have in boxes as well, you talk about how it can be a little bit nuanced in areas as well, and how it may not work so well. So I think taking all those things into account, reading this book could be so powerful for the teacher who's really probably not quite sure whether they need to adapt their practice or not. And yeah, I thought that worked really well.
I'm glad to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, you talk quite quickly in your book about pedagogical content knowledge, and refer to things like conceptual challenges, distinguishing between abstract ideas, and how limiting thinking can often be limited to sort of like 2D impressions. Do you think pedagogical content knowledge is spoken about enough? And what do you think we could do as experienced teachers to bring about more discussion about this?
I think definitions are important, right? And I found defining pedagogical content knowledge quite difficult because the research is quite varied, and it's a bit like metacognition in the sense that it's a big word that can encompass a lot of things. And I would argue that trying to improve someone's pedagogical content knowledge is not a good strategy. Because there are so many things that could be included in there. It's like when people say, my performance management target for this year is to embed metacognition in the classroom. I'm like, okay, so like what does that actually, like, there's about a zillion things. Yeah, there's about a zillion things that could be called metacognition. That's not the case when it comes to like retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is the act of pulling a memory out of the long-term memory. There's no, like, you can't argue that definition because that's literally what it is.
Yeah, whereas it's clear evidence whether it's done or not. So
exactly. Whereas metacognition can include anyone and his dog. So, and pedagogical content knowledge sort of can go a bit that way. And that's why I think, if I remember correctly, there's a little Venn diagram that I drew in the book to try and illustrate what I mean by it. And basically, what I mean by it is the stuff about a subject that a teacher knows that an expert in that subject doesn't know. So I'm a chemist. And there's a lot that a professional chemist at university or whatever knows that I don't know. Yeah, like loads of high-level chemistry and stuff. And there's a lot that we both know, stuff about bonding and ions and rates of reaction and blah, blah, blah. And then there's stuff that I know about chemistry that they don't know. So I know the best way to sequence teaching ions. I know that when I'm doing rates of reaction, it's best to start with the calculations before you start talking about the factors that affect rates of reaction. Now, I've got my reasons for that. and they're not reasons that that person, that hypothetical professional chemist, shares. It's those things that I call pedagogical content knowledge. So things about the subject that an expert in that subject wouldn't know. And I think saying to someone you need to improve in that general area isn't helpful. I think it would be more helpful. I prefer, I mentor a lot of, I have mentored and coached a lot of teachers, and I
Yeah.
much prefer to like zoom in on very, very specific ideas. And I'd say to someone, instead of, if I had someone who I thought their sequencing felt a bit dodgy at times,
Hmm.
saying to them you need to improve your sequencing is just terrible feedback.
Yeah.
It's not a good way to improve someone's sequencing. It would be much better to say what you're teaching next week, and let's say, oh, I'm teaching atoms into ions. Say, okay, fine, let's sit down and work out how you're going to sequence that.
Hmm.
That is more powerful. And yeah, it is pedagogical content knowledge, but at that point, the phrase doesn't actually help anybody. So I wouldn't use it, because I want to be helpful. And part of the problem as well here is that we have, as a profession, we've like fetishized getting obsessed with very specific ideas and turning them into like this huge big thing, which doesn't actually pay dividends. Metacognition is a great example. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
one of the I'm very lucky. People ask me questions. They ask me for help. They ask me for support. And one of the most common things I get from heads of department is about how do they implement metacognition in their curriculum or whatever. And I was like, just don't. Like, people are like, but my SLT line manager is saying I need to. I said, okay, well, what are the things that you want to actually do this year that you think will make your teaching
Yeah.
better? Like, oh, I want to get better at using worked examples. I'm like, okay, call that metacognition and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
But it's like that, you can go that way really quickly with a whole bunch of ideas. Pedagogical content knowledge is the same. It's always better to be specific, to be concrete, to look at actual examples rather than to talk about these generalities. And then people publish books about all this stuff that are completely useless. And people read them and go, "Oh, that's really interesting," and it changes nothing about practice the next day because they're so abstract, they're so general, they're so inclusive that they just don't mean anything on the ground.
Yeah.
In my experience, definitely someone's now going to be like, "Oh, but what about the EF guide to metacognition?" Yeah, fine. Yeah, it's not my bag.
I think sometimes though, even like you can take the EF guidance for example, but if they can give almost, I guess, examples of how to implement certain strategies related, then that can work a lot better. But I think what we struggle with a lot in education is, especially with ideas like metacognition as well as others, is people are so quick to try to box it up, package it, and practically sell it
Yeah.
as a big idea, where quite rightly people come back and say, but that is just teaching, that is just learning. And I do think people are right there. But what you talk about, which I think kind of, I think this gave me a really good way of verbalizing it by stealing what you said. And it's where you said that this, we've got terms like quality first teaching, cognitive science, and like pedagogical content knowledge. And there's a lot of pushback that people have on the use of these terms because they argue that it's always been around, it's always been understood, and now we're just giving it a name. But what are your thoughts on sort of like developing this shared language and generalizing these strategies, which is something you talk about, to communicate well between teachers, whether that's within a department or a larger network?
I think, well, I've got a glossary in the book, yeah, like of phrases either I've borrowed from others or made up myself. I think terminology and shared language is absolutely crucial. If you don't have it, you will fail. And I take my lead here from the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. So these people, they wanted to build a tower to the gods, or God, depending on how you read the story. And basically, they wanted to like challenge and take war to the gods and be like them. And the way that God punishes them is he mixes up their language. So before they could all speak, they all spoke the same language, and he causes them to all speak a different language. And like, the problem is, someone would say to their mate, "They're like, oh, we're building a town. Like, give me a hammer," and they'd give him a screwdriver. And they'd be like, no, I need the hammer, and they'd give him a saw. And it's like, if you don't have the language to describe the things that you're talking about, then it doesn't help anybody. So precise definitions are crucial. And the point is, phrases like metacognition, cognitive science, evidence-based practice resist firm definition,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I would rather talk about, another really good example is things like assessment for learning, or formative assessment. People say, well, what's the difference between a summative and a formative assessment? And I'm like, well, summative is like at the end of a unit and formative is like in the middle, and it's about making the person better. I'm like, does summative assessments not also do that? Like the whole point, when someone does a summative assessment, that they revise for it, they become better at the subject, and then afterwards they get a grade, and they're like, there's like an impetus there. So like, it's just not helpful. Like, why does it? Who does it help? It's not a good distinguishing phrase. So I don't like using phrases that I don't think have clear definitions. So like I like cold call. Cold call's got a great definition.
Mm-hmm.
Cold call is a questioning technique that has two components. You have to put the name at the end of the question, and you have to target your question. Doesn't matter if they've got their hand up or down, you've targeted it to the student that you want. If you don't have those two things, you're not doing cold call, right? You're doing something else. And that's fine. If someone wants to do something else, that's fine. But there's a time and a place where cold call is the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be able to communicate that you should have used cold call. Now, if someone says to me, oh, well, what's cold call? And I'm like, well, it's really any questioning technique where you're doing like this or like this or like that or the other. It's just like an absolute faff. Nobody improves that way. Just be precise, be concrete, and try and keep things as like well-defined as possible. And then if you start to stray into this sort of generalized language, differentiation is a great, what is meant by differentiation? Fuck no, sorry, you told me I'm not supposed to swear, but like it doesn't, quality first teaching. Again, there's like this big argument about what is meant by quality first teaching, and I'm like, I don't care. It's like, it's not helpful. Like, can you imagine saying to a trainee, what do you need to improve your quality first teaching? It's
tells them nothing.
And then people, and then it also gives, a salve, like a balm to those people who say, oh, well, we've always done this. And I'm like, you've just not, like, if, for example, in the book, there's over 100 pages on what makes a quality explanation. Over 100 pages. I looked high and I looked low for research literature on what makes a good explanation in science. It just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. So I've had to make up words to describe the things that I think make a good explanation. I've made those up. And then if someone turns around to me and says, well, we've always done it like this, I can't be asked for that. I just don't care, right? Those, there is no, I just got no time for it.
I remember there was an argument not too long ago on Twitter, of course, about quality first teaching and how it's always been there. But my question was, oh, you've always done it? Yeah. Okay, what did you do? But not being able to answer what you did, which
I've always done quality first teaching.
Okay, what did you do? And if you can't answer that, then have you always done it, or do you just not understand what that means, or you're just making assumptions? It's and I do completely agree with you that these these terms that we come up with, they're very sort of like general. They're just not specific at all. But they can be very useful when we are trying to box things up and just generally trying to highlight an area that we need to look at. Like if quality first teaching is pretty poor in an area, then we can start to look at why it is and what makes it up. But yeah, absolutely. Same. These whole general terms just, I think, cause a lot of conflict really in teaching, don't they? And we see
unless they're well defined. Exactly. And they tend not to be. And that doesn't mean they're not useful to somebody. I don't deny that there is a large research literature on metacognition that a lot of people find very useful. It's just not useful to me as a teacher.
Yeah. Or it's just not useful as, giving somebody something to improve on. It's just not something they can take away and use. It's not something you can identify as being good or bad straight away, or completed or not completed. So definitely that specific really needs drawing out. So you talk in your book about the need for the sort of prerequisite question sort of assessment, so we can work out where the kids are, what they know, what they don't know, kind of filling in those gaps. How important do you suggest it is to organise these as a department and use them very consistently?
That's a good question. I think there is with any question to do with planning, there is a careful balance. And there's a balance between, you can have some departments where you've got strong centralized resources, and those resources are the lesson. So I know that when I'm teaching year 8 lesson 8.2 from whatever unit, this is the PowerPoint that I use. And the worry that I have is that, and then then the other end of the spectrum, you've got chaos, right? You've got people who've got, zillions of different files, and everyone's got different like name at the end of it, and no clear curriculum, and blah
Edits.
blah blah.
Yeah.
Now the problem with that is this massive workload driver. Yeah, when you say to people, essentially you need to plan every lesson from scratch. That is like, it's just terrible leadership, and it's not healthy. People don't have the time to do this. And then at the other end, if you plan everything for somebody, then I'm not sure it's that you're de-skilling them, but it's that they lose the ability to be responsive. So say, for example, I plan, I've written an explanation for somebody else, and I've written 5 check for understanding questions. So they run through the explanation, then they do the check for understanding questions, and the kids get all the questions wrong. So what do they do next? Now, if I've said to this teacher, all the stuff you need is in this PowerPoint, just go in and teach, then they've got no ability. They're not going in thinking that they're going to need to be responsive. They're not going in thinking that they know what's going to happen if someone gets these 5 questions wrong.
Yeah.
I was a bit mean. I did to my we have a lot of like trainee teachers and stuff at school, and I did a session with them about stuff like this. And essentially what I did is I asked them what they were teaching the next day, and across the course of the session, they wrote they were going to be teaching X, and they had 3 check for understanding questions they were going to ask on X.
Yeah.
And then for each one of those, I made them write 3 follow-ups if they got any of those wrong.
Yep.
Right. And then I made them write another 3 follow-ups if they got any one of those wrong. So by the end, they had about 27, I think, because it was like 3 times 3 times 3. So they had 27 questions mapped out. And the point is, you might not need any of them. I mean, you'll definitely need your first 3, but you might not need any of the next 24. But if you haven't got them, then you need to be able to plan them on the spot.
Yep.
And you need to know going in that that's something that you are expected to have to do. So then when that makes things complicated when it comes to planning, right? Because I could write 27 questions for every concept that has been explained throughout the course of a scheme of unit. Am I doing someone a favor if I do that for them? Well, it depends. If they're in their first week of teaching, maybe yes. If they're 6 months into teaching, less so. If they're 5 years into teaching, I'm sending the complete wrong message if I do that. And the same is true of prerequisite questions, because, where you're checking whether or not students are ready to access today's lesson. It's something that's fundamentally responsive, it's dynamic, you have to adapt to the students that are in front of you, and you have to go in with that mindset.
Yeah.
And if you go in with the mindset that, like PowerPoint is such a static resource, it's so planned. It's like, it's this, then this, then this, then this, then this. It's not, what are they called? The choose your own adventure books.
Oh yeah, they were brilliant.
If you do this, then go to page whatever. If you do that, go to page. Yeah, never have I ever seen a PowerPoint slide that says at the bottom, if they got this question right, move on to this slide. If they got this question
literally
wrong,
having this conversation this morning. Yeah.
It's like it's really static. It's very straitjacketed. Like, and of course, it doesn't mean a teacher can't respond with it.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're using PowerPoint and the kids get a check for understanding question wrong, that doesn't mean you can't ask the next question. It means you're less likely to, because your whole thinking, your mindset is that my lesson is a static, pre-organized, planned thing. For me, that's problematic. So I think that the mindset is crucial, and then how much support is given kind of feeds into that. Some people will need more support with it, some people will need less. Like if someone's been teaching for 3 weeks, expecting them to come up with a whole bunch of check for understanding questions on the fly is unreasonable.
Absolutely.
So it's, and also the thing about some of the check for understanding and prerequisite stuff is that there are things that might occur to me that wouldn't occur to others. So for example, if I've just taught atomic structure, electron shells and stuff, a question that I always ask is what's between the shells. Because I know that students 9 times out of 10 say air.
Always.
And I know that's wrong, but I didn't know that was going to be a thing the first time I taught it or the second time I taught it. So obviously I'm going to want to feed that into the process. So it's a complicated, it's basically what I'm saying at root is it's complicated. There's a balancing act. You need to benefit from everybody. You need to get that conversation going. And some of the stuff is debatable as well. You know, what really is prerequisite knowledge for a particular
Yeah.
concept.
Mm-hmm.
And there can be real joy in having those conversations. Don't get me wrong, but as far as like building it into a scheme of work is concerned, it's difficult, you know. And we tend not to. So we've got in our booklets, we generally haven't planned in prerequisite knowledge checks, and we haven't planned in checks for understanding. We expect generally teachers to think of those and implement them for themselves.
And I suppose that comes then with part of your training and developing teachers. It's more of a case of, you know, supporting individuals to be prepared to have those skills to do so, rather than just churning out booklets or PowerPoints, however you decide to do it, that mean you sort of robbing them of the opportunity to put their development in practice, to actually show that they can do this and have those
Yeah.
responses during the lesson.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the technique that I advocate for check for understanding, the quick and dirty check for understanding or check and consolidate,
Love the name.
is it's a classic. I think lends itself to helping people get better at doing a check for understanding. You know, if I again saying to someone, do a check, you need to get better at your checks for understanding isn't helpful. But when I say to someone, look, the easiest way to check for understanding for anything that you've taught is to just take your diagram that you've constructed, your explanation, just rub words out and just
Mm-hmm.
ask about those. And that's like a really simple strategy that works in 90% of cases.
Yeah.
And it means you don't need to have like this crazy pedagogical content knowledge where you've taught this
Yeah.
thing 15 years in a row, whatever, because just that process is going to get you like it's not the best check for understanding the world has ever seen, but it's going to be 90% of the way there.
Yeah. And it does the job without having to, you know, have, because nobody has a lot of time. Nobody has all the time to plan everything perfectly and, you know, do
Correct.
it all up front. And even as a department, I think we often find, don't we, that when you want to get something done quick, we often like carve up what needs to be done by who. And then you get so many inconsistencies. So is it really done
It's never
well?
that quick.
Is anybody ever actually going to use somebody else's stuff well? That's what I always find. I pick up somebody else's resources, and the first thing I think is, ugh, no, I need to redo most of it, if not all of it. And especially where, you know, you haven't really embedded those key ideas that you want as a department, where you haven't driven the ideas of some of those key ways to check for understanding. For example, key ways of doing explanations. Have they just put a load of bullet points on the PowerPoint and things like that? So
Yeah, you know, it's a difficult thing to get right. And what I found when I worked in schools that had these PowerPoint schemes of work that had been divvied out to loads of people, that you end up with these completely unteachable lessons because
yeah,
I've got my unit to prepare, and everyone makes their offset outstanding lesson for every lesson in that thing, and I'm like, I can't teach any of these. So I think, and what we do is you know, our department is very, very consistent. You could walk through every classroom in the science corridor and see pretty much the same stuff being taught in the same style, but it's taken a long time to get there. We all use the same booklets, but the booklets are relatively bare bones. There's an explanation in the booklet for whatever you're teaching, but we would absolutely never use that to explain it. So we don't do like, okay, today we're learning about electrostatic charges. Open your booklets to page 5. Let's begin reading. Like it just doesn't happen. It's there as a support for afterwards, more rather
yes,
than a tool at the start. But everybody does more or less the same practice questions because you know there doesn't have to be a discrepancy between those. They're all going to be fine, and we use the same curriculum. The core questions guarantees that we're all teaching the same stuff. But everything else, like your explanation, your check for understanding, your prerequisite knowledge check, you have to craft that. There's a limit to what you can outsource to somebody else. And I think that we've hit that kind of sweet spot between helping everybody's workload, but also not ruining their like autonomy or craft or skill or ability to adapt in the classroom.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important trying to balance it as well, isn't it? And I think one of the key things you've just said there is this didn't happen overnight. You know, it works really well. There is a lot of consistency. There is some real skill, obviously, being developed there, but it doesn't just happen in one term. It's not something people could just throw together in those 4 weeks of game time in July. It's something that develops over time. And I think that's something that a lot of departments probably struggle with, because it's such an idea that everything has to be perfect now, or, oh, we'll just start with the topics that are upcoming and then we'll do the rest throughout the year. And actually, even then, you have like tight points in the year, don't you, when you actually can't spend that much time thinking forwards and thinking like about the planning going forward. So I think looking at it as a more long-term developmental project is so much more useful for a department going forwards. You talk in your book about the redundancy effect. So I guess that was the idea of having a little bit too much information, and it's kind
too
of
much of the same information.
Say again?
Too much.
Oh, this is going well.
Oh, we're back.
Oh, we're back. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Right, sorry. Redundancy effect. Too much of the same information. Yeah. So almost like a definition, talking around the subject, exploring it in context, sort of all in one go.
I think in the literature it's more limited than that. It's where you give the same information more than one time. So the classic example is having words on a slide and reading them out at the same time.
Yes.
Everybody hates it, and yet it still happens. So again, people will say nobody ever does this. Okay, fine. Invite me into your department. I'll be more than happy to come. It's work that I do. I go spend a day with the science department somewhere in the country, and I promise you, we will see teachers reading off slides. It's just like so standard, yeah, it's just not good for the brain. It's just a bad way to explain stuff.
Absolutely, and I think this can be one of the sort of products of carving up, sending out different topics to different people, because everybody wants to explain their topic really well to sort of like non-specialists, which happens a lot in the science department. I think we are one of the departments that probably flit so much between the different subject areas of being a specialist, not being a specialist in that area. And then if a chemist wants to hand me a lesson to explain really, really well, they'll put all the information on the PowerPoint rather than expect teachers to go away and learn it. And I don't know if it's this sort of expectation that people are just not going to have the time, so just giving it all to them to work with. But obviously it can be quite detrimental, because as you said, we have this redundancy effect, and a lot of people then want to go and sort of like summarize all this. So I think you end up spending a lot of time having a very sort of like low thinking ratio really with your students.
Yeah. I think there's a distinction that I think a lot of people don't make, which is between what's teacher facing and what's student facing. You know, if you want to give people really detailed guidance about how to explain something, like, why does it need to be on the slides? Like that's teacher facing, right? Your notes need to be teacher facing. Everything else needs to be student facing. So I think that distinction can help people as well, figuring out what's useful information for the teacher and what's useful information for the student. Then, of course, you have the problem of the under preparation. When someone rocks up to a lesson, they just assume everything's going to be on the slides, and then it's not, and they're like, oh, and then they're like shuffling, trying to go through the notes or whatever, or things don't make sense or whatever, and it's just like problems abound. It's just it's a universal issue.
Absolutely. We've actually had quite a nice question from Dom, which I'm going to pop on the screen. Hopefully
From
you'll
Dom.
see it. Dom.
Hello,
Dom asks, in your book, you introduce the terminology for consolidation and sort of replacing the phrase guided practice. What do you think the benefit in that is?
It's a good question. I think consolidation includes more things. So essentially, what we're referring to is if a student is to learn something, they need to go from a position where they don't know it at all, where it does not exist in their heads, to a point where it not only exists in their heads, but is well connected with their other knowledge. How you get from 0 to hero is a complicated process. And you always start that process with, I'm sorry, I'm trying to because my camera's backwards. Okay, so we're going to start here. Yeah, there we go. Right. That's your explanation. And then at the end, there's like independent practice where the students are just getting on with the work. And then there's something in the middle. And the two most common phrases used for the something in the middle is guided practice or we. So I, we, you. And I don't love those terms because I think guided practice is just, it could be a bit open. I'm not sure exactly what's included within guided practice and what's not. And I think it could include stuff like where you let the students get on with some work. If I said you need to do guided practice here, they say, okay, that's fine. And then I'd go observe their lesson and they'd do their explanation, and the kids would do independent practice, and they'd be going around circulating and helping kids as they go. And they'd say to me, I was doing guided practice, and I'm saying, yeah, but like, it's just not a good way to prepare students. Like, the point is to prepare them to. So I don't really like that. The we thing as well is complicated, because do you mean one other person or lots of other people? So let's say I've just explained how to plug in the numbers for a speed, distance, time calculation. So I do a nice worked example, and then the student does an example with me up on the board. Yes, okay, what's the next line? Good. What's the next line? Good. What's the next line? Good. What's the next line? Brilliant. Have I done a we? Well, yes, because it was me and this kid. Even if I say, okay, so I'm going to do the worked example, then one student does the first line, then a different student does the second line, then the different student does the third line. Have I done a we? Yes. Is it like really great? No. So I prefer consolidation, because the first thing is that consolidation is a process that happens in the kid's head. So the issue I said before with the we is that it could be that nobody else is listening or doing anything, right? You've got four levels of your calculation, so at most you've got 4 kids, yeah. And however good your questioning strategies are, you've got good odds that other kids aren't doing anything. Whereas if I say no, what you need to do is make sure the students are consolidating their learning. That's something that happens in every single one of their heads. So I can't just say, well, I've done this, because the point is, what's it done in the kid's head? And it also means that guided practice thing, again, like, guided practice tells me an action that I need to do as a teacher, rather than how I need to think about what's happening in the students' heads. So I prefer the phrase consolidation. It is also a phrase that's used in cognitive science quite a bit when it comes to really embedding and concretizing learning. So it's just a phrase that I like, and I think it bridges the gap between being open enough to include a number of strategies, but being clear enough to exclude other strategies. So if you do questioning one-to-one, you've done a we, but you've not done consolidation. If you've got students waiting for you to help as they're doing independent practice, you've done guided practice, but you've not actually consolidated anything in those kids' heads. So that's why I like it.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And the focus we need to have on what are the kids doing rather than what are we doing is so absolutely so important. Is that something you really drive with your trainees and people you develop? Is it more a case of, have you thought about what the kids are doing at this point? Have you thought about what they are thinking, what they are processing? Is that a point you really try to drive them?
It's also one that you can go too far with, because the two are inextricably related. You know, the way that the things that you say and the way you interact with the class are the proximal cause of what the students then do. So if you focus on one at the expense of the other, I was once told off for I observed a lesson, or the context is complicated, but I observed a lesson, and afterwards they said, you looked a lot at what the teacher was doing, but you didn't look at what the students were doing. And I'm like, I just think it's a silly distinction. It's not a silly distinction, because it's one that I just made. It is like an important thing to think about, but you can take it too far. So if I think not looking at the teacher would be daft. I think not looking at the students would also be daft. What I try to do is I try to watch when I observe a lesson, and the way that we observe lessons at my school is wildly different to the way that most people observe lessons. We have a lot of visitors, and a lot of what I do with them is I show them how I observe a lesson, and they're like, and it's basically, it's like intently focused. And what I do is I don't really have good phrases to describe it yet, but it's basically like hypothesis generating. And what I do is I wait for the teacher to do something that I think will lead to a problem in terms of students' learning. So the teacher will they might be asking, like a student might be asking a question. Yeah, let's say they've just finished the explanation and a kid asks the question, and the teacher takes the question. The kid says, why is it the root hair cells don't do photosynthesis? And the teacher says, yeah, it's a really good question. And it's because they're underground. There's no light underground, so they don't have any chloroplasts and they don't do any photosynthesis. When I see that, I'm worried. And the reason why I'm worried is because when one student asks a question to the teacher, most other students stop listening. Yeah, so I think in my head, and the teacher's not done anything to make sure that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, well, it seems to me like these other kids won't have been paying attention. So I'll wait for the teacher to finish their explanation, and then I'll go to another kid and I'll ask them the same question the first kid asked.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, why is it that root hair cells don't do photosynthesis? And if they like look at me like I'm completely mental or they don't have a good answer, then my hypothesis was right.
Yeah.
And I can then say to the teacher afterwards, what you should have done is said, that is a brilliant question. Everyone knows up here. Lovely. David has asked, has anyone got a good answer for me? And then do a check for understanding afterwards. There was a really good one I did recently at a school that I visited in East London, where I thought the way the teacher was giving instructions was poor. I thought they hadn't got full attention first. The instructions were a bit garbled. The teacher was like walking around the room giving out sheets while they were giving the instructions, which I think is bad practice. So I proved it, because what I did is the teacher they were doing some work and the teacher said, you've got 15 minutes to do whatever. I just went to a kid and I said, how long do you have to do this? And they were like, oh, I don't know, sir. And I was like, well, she said you've got 15 minutes twice, right? Now, whether or not the kid knows they've got 15 minutes is like moot. Nobody cares, right? I don't care if a kid knows how long they've got, but it shows that they weren't listening or they didn't get the instructions. Because if they were listening, if they did, internalize the instruction, they know there's 15 minutes. So it's about watching the teacher and then trying to figure out what goes on. One exercise that I like doing with people that I'm training how to observe a lesson is, let's say a teacher is explaining something. Let's say they're doing calculations or whatever. I'll just say to them, look, we're going to leave. I say to the people I'm observing with, I say, we're going to go in 15 minutes. We're going to go now. We're going to come back in 15 minutes. How many questions do you think the class will have done by the time we get back in 15 minutes? That's the hypothesis. Yeah, that's your prediction. And they'll say, oh, we think they'll have done 3 or 4 questions. I say, okay, good. And how do you think they will have done in them? So about 75% correct. So I say, good. And I say, by the way, I think you're completely wrong. Yeah, I think they will still be on the worked example. And if they've moved beyond the worked example, everyone will be getting it wrong. And I'll say, and I think that's because the explanation was garbled. It wasn't clear. There aren't any mini whiteboards on the desks, which means that students aren't doing any consolidation work. There's not a strong check for understanding, which means that what I predict will happen, we'll come back in 15 minutes. We'll see a lot of kids struggling. We'll see a lot of hands in the air. We'll see a lot of kids chatting to each other. We'll see a lot of kids waiting for the teacher. We'll see the teacher going from student to student, giving guidance on a particular question or whatever. And then we'll go out and we'll come back in 15 minutes later and we'll see whose hypothesis was correct. I would love it if I were wrong. I'd say 80% of the time I get it right. But that's a really powerful activity, because what you're doing is you're raising a question based on what the teacher has done. I walked into a lesson just this past week. The teacher was talking about detritivores and taught the students about best conditions for decay, and had on the board 3 things, said written warm, moist, and oxygen rich. And they were just kind of wrapping up and the kids were about to start practice. And I see a phrase like oxygen rich on the boards and I'm like, do 12-year-olds know what oxygen rich means? And that's going to be the test of the explanation, right? If they don't know what the phrase oxygen rich means, then the explanation is no good. If they do know what it means, then we're great. And so I went and I asked 3 students, and they all knew what it meant. So I said, fine, and I walked out. Yeah, because the explanation is good. There's no feedback needed. But it's about noticing stuff like that, points where it could go wrong, making a prediction, and then figuring it out.
Absolutely. I really like talking about this actually, because it makes you sort of sit there and ponder what you do in your own practice and think about how right you are actually getting these things. It's so common when we have observations for people to comment on what you've done but have absolutely no idea what happened in terms of the students' minds. So really good.
Yeah, definitely. There's no, you have to be honest, and you have to be you have to have a certain humility with it, because you can look at a teacher and say, well, I think you're doing this wrong, but how do you know you're right? So the whole point is you then go check and see. If I see that there's not been a check for understanding, teacher explains something, there's no check for understanding, kids jump straight into independent practice. So I'm like, okay, well, I could predict that the quality of what students write is going to be rubbish. Like, this teacher knows their class better. So I then go have a look in the books and I take pictures of the work they're doing. And if it's all fine and good, correct, great. I have no feedback to give, except for just be careful. Yeah, just be careful, because it's a risky business. But then if I go around and I look in the books and I see they're writing absolute nonsense, which is what normally happens if there's no check for understanding, I say to the teacher after this, I say, do you not think they needed a check for understanding? And if the teacher says, yeah, it was a mistake, I should have done one, then we're fine. If the teacher says, no, I think they got it, I said, look, they really didn't. Look at what they've written. It's just nonsense. And then rare is the teacher who says, no, I still think that's fine. Most teachers will be like, yeah, that's useful feedback. And then, you can move forward from there. But if you don't do that, it's like, it just ends up being a waste of time.
And a lot of the observations we have or we do can, they can be so isolated. And if you don't really see what's going on in those classrooms over time, you can't make those assumptions based on what's necessarily good or bad without, evidence to back it up or a conversation of what's had before. So just as you've said about looking at, making a prediction, making a hypothesis, and then checking for that, so much better than just an isolated observation that says, I recommend that you do this. Well, actually, we don't know if that's going to be good feedback or not, unless it's something we've had prior evidence for and we can see it hasn't worked. So yeah, fantastic talk about observations there, I think. One of the things I really loved in the book, and I definitely want to go over this before we wrap up today, is your idea of is it direction of transfer dots? Travel. You know what? Similar. So direction of travel. I have not heard it put this way before, and I thought that was really interesting. So I just wondered if you'd be able to tell our viewers a little bit about what dots mean, why it's important, and then just, do you think we talk about this enough as a profession?
So directions of travel is a phrase that I came up with when thinking, and we mentioned earlier how to craft an explanation. And like I said, to my knowledge, there is no extant literature on how to make a good explanation. And by the way, it's really important, whenever I say this to people, it's really important they know I'm not caricaturing here. I have 3 or 4 of the standard issue PGC textbooks, one which is general, a 16th edition of Learning to Teach in the Secondary School, and 3 or so which are science specific. None of them have anything about explanations. Yeah, there's a lot about misconceptions, cultural capital, building relationships, the role of governing boards, safety in the lab, all of that. Nothing about how to build an explanation. Okay, so please don't think for a second that I'm just accusing the other side of this. Teach like a champion, not a word. Yeah, there's not a word about explanations in there. That's fine. It's not what the book's trying to do. Sure, but there's nothing there. Rosenstein. Yeah, Rosenshine's principles of instruction. One of the principles is to break new information into small chunks. That's it. Yeah, okay, I get that, but how small? Which chunks?
Yeah.
What order should the chunks go in? Are there not any cases where I should do more than that? Is that the only characteristic of a good explanation? Yeah, like obviously it's not sufficient. Dan Willingham, Why Don't Students Like School? He has a section about explanations where he talks about the 4 C's of a good explanation. But I think there's only a couple of very brief examples. They're not all applicable to all subjects. He talks about conflict and character and something else I can't remember. And yeah, it's an interesting chapter, but I don't think it gives people enough guidance onto how to actually craft an explanation. So there's not a lot out there. And so I tried really hard to figure out what the kind of moving parts of a good explanation are, and then how I could codify and communicate those to others. And I was very lucky that the people in my team were really excited by explanations and how to write good ones. And it really helped us, because what we would do is we'd explain something, we'd say, I think that was a really good explanation, and then we'd try and figure out what is it about it that made it a good explanation.
Yeah.
And so
it's kind of trying to identify those key features that indicate that it's good, that
correct.
You can take and repeat and utilize again.
Yeah, exactly. It's about moving something from being intuitive to being explicit, or being tacit to being explicit. And there's a number of components that make a good explanation. And one of those is the way that your explanation is ordered. So your explanation goes in a specific order. You start by talking about something, then you continue by talking about something else, then you continue by talking about a third thing, and then a fourth thing. But like, what order do you put those in? How do you arrange those? Where's the best place to start? Where do you want to finish? That's what I call a direction of travel. And I think there's 9 or 10 in the book that illustrate the movement that you should make. One of them is, and there are 3 that I think are the most important that pretty much every explanation should have. Not every explanation, but the majority. One is concrete to abstract, so always starting with something that is tangible and sensible, so ability to be sensed or perceived, and then moving to the abstract concept or idea. So if you're talking about change of state, you want to start by talking about ice turning into water. Yeah, that's melting. But you start with ice and water rather than solids and liquids, because ice and water are concrete. They're things which you can touch and smell and taste and feel, whereas there is no human alive who has touched or smelt or tasted or felt the concept of melting. Yeah, it's not. It's a concept, right? Nobody's touched the universal idea of a solid because it doesn't exist. It's an idea, right? So you always start with something highly concrete. And yeah, I was doing just this week with my year 9s. There was a question that flummoxed them, which was percentages of percentages. So the question was about you've got a certain number of molecules, and a certain number of those are oxygen molecules, and a certain number of those have an isotope. And it says what percentage of the total number of molecules have that isotope. And they just like couldn't get their heads around it because percentages are really abstract. And I did a bad job because first I was like, okay, let's just simplify this example. We'll start with 100,000 molecules and this and that. And they were still struggling. And I was like, okay, right, fuck it. We've got 40 students. Okay. 30 of them are girls. Out of the girls, 50% of them wear glasses. How many girls wear glasses? And they were like, oh, 15. I said, okay, what percentage of the total number of students are girls who wear glasses? And they're like, okay, we get this now. Yeah, but it's a highly concrete example. And you start with that, and then you steadily get more abstract. You know, if you're teaching adaptations, show the kids an adaptation and then talk about adaptation, because the idea of adaptations is abstract. Camouflage is concrete. So that's a really good direction of travel. Familiar to unfamiliar, always start with knowledge that students have. So, for example, you know, when I was doing change of state, I could have started with a lump of titanium chloride and said, well, this is titanium chloride as a solid. You can then melt it, turn it into a liquid, and then you can really, really heat it up loads and it will turn into a gas. And they'd just be like, because it's not like you start with something familiar. It happens in this case that familiar and concrete overlap. They don't always. You start with things that the students do know, and you build up to stuff that students don't know. I was playing Dobble with my daughter over the weekend. Yeah. You know Dobble? It's a little game where you've got these little circles and they've got pictures of things, right?
Oh, yes.
And you
Yeah.
have to match, right? And each circle has got seven or eight pictures, and you've got a circle with 7 or 8, and you have to see if there's any that overlap. And we've got one at home that is Gruffalo, right? And it's got the Gruffalo, and it's got the mouse, and it's got the sick, and it's got the owl and stuff. And she really likes that. And we were at somebody else's house over the weekend, and they've got a Harry Potter version. And like, she doesn't know anything about Harry Potter. And she was really struggling with the game because she just like couldn't match up the concepts with words in her head. And she was like, it just didn't quite work out for her. And she was much slower than when she plays the Gruffalo game because like it's just less familiar to her. And then the final one is what that I think again is most important, is what I call explanation to definition, which is where instead of what I see most teachers doing is they state their definition at the outset as part of a lesson objective or as part of the explanation. They say, today we're going to learn about diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of particles from the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration of those particles to an area of low concentration of those particles. Let's show you what that means, right? At best, your kids, then there's no way they're going to understand what you said, because if they did understand what you said, your lesson is a waste of time because they know it already. And you know, the likelihood is they don't get it. So at best, it's just to them. At worst, it's like, I'm never going to understand this.
Yeah.
That's just too complicated. Forget it.
And then they're switching off before you even, you know.
Yeah, so I much prefer to like build a concept from something concrete and familiar, build it up, show how it works. And then at the end, turn around and say, and this is what we call diffusion.
Yes.
Or this is what we call an adaptation. I said, look at the polar bear, look at the color it is, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, by the way, also, a polar bear has got really long hair. Why do you think it's got such long hair? It's got to keep itself warm. Okay. Now, this is a camel. Camels, they don't have long hair. They've got short hair. Why do you think they have short hair? Very good, because they want to keep cool. All of these things, we call them adaptations. Yeah. Or actually, to be honest, I'd even say these are ways that we'd say that the animal is adapted, because to adapt means to like suit. So they're adapted, they're suited to their environment. And we call these things all together as adaptations. Done. And that's going to always be better than saying today we're learning about adaptations, which are way the organisms are suited to their environment. Let's go. So yeah, those are the three main dots, but there are others as well. So I like wood, trees, woods, hinterland's core, stuff like that.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's really nice to go through some of the examples of sort of like what you mean by the dots, because I think to somebody who's not read it or somebody who's still developing, the idea might seem completely bonkers, because why do we need to really think about a direction of travel with regards to explanations? But when you actually look at these examples and you actually think about, especially as a novice learner, so somebody who's coming as a novice, being faced with, for example, a definition, we can start to maybe consider how it can be overwhelming, how it can give the wrong idea before we even start. So yeah, some brilliant examples there. Now, we have been here now for an hour, so I've got one more question from Dom, and then there's a question from Lewis. And while I let Adam talk about these questions, if anybody who is watching today would like to be with a chance of winning a copy of Adam's book, it's behind me, I'll leave it. Is it? I don't know. If anybody would like to win with a chance of winning the book, could you please drop your name into the comments on YouTube? That'll pop up on my screen. I'll put you into the draw, and I'll attempt to do that live if it shows. So I'm going to pass over to Adam for a couple of questions while I look out for names and start to get typing. Here's your first one. So, does your school now train teachers? And if so, will they use your book in training, I assume, for the...
Yeah, I mean, like we have trainees in the department. I don't use the book with them because the book is a suboptimal way to learn, because it's a book, which is like a lot of stuff. I'd much rather break things down slowly with a trainee, which is what we do. I think there've been a couple of occasions where I've said it would be easier if you read through this before we meet, but most of the time I won't use it. No. It's also like it's a bit of a dick move. It's like, just so you know, I wrote the book on this.
Here's my book.
Yeah,
go learn it.
Yeah, I try not to.
We've got a question from Lewis as well. So, have you ever considered writing a book aimed at students about how to learn?
Please don't encourage me to write another book. It's like it's a lot of effort. My wife will murder me. I'd love to one day, but again, like, it's so much of teaching students is books are a rubbish way to teach students anything. That's why we have teachers. But books are basically a rubbish way to teach people things. Yeah, the way that I explained dots just now is probably better than just sitting and reading it through in a book. And certainly, if I want someone to actually implement stuff, just giving a book is not gonna. It's better than nothing. I mean, the John Catt team are going to murder me for saying this, because it doesn't exactly drive sales when you tell people that books are rubbish for learning. But like, they're way better than nothing. And I like to think that the book helps. But fundamentally, if a person's just read a 400-page book over the last couple of weeks, they're not going to be able to implement all of it tomorrow. It's just not how it works.
I don't know. That's what I'm attempting to do. So, I'll take how it goes.
Good luck. But the same would apply for students. If I wrote a 200-page book about how learning happens and the things that you as a student need to do, I'm sure it would be better than nothing. But how much of it would actually be like internalized and acted upon? How many of us give that same shtick to our students before the exams, and they can't just reread or highlight or summarize? They need to retrieval practice, and then next week we see them rereading and highlighting and summarizing. So there's a sort of diminishing returns aspect to it as well. So I'm not saying it's useless or something I'd never do. I'd love to, but time is finite.
Yeah, and it's whether or not students would really kind of buy into that as well. I'm sure it's something, if implemented well, maybe by teachers, but again, then it's kind of putting the onus back onto the teachers for that. So
Agreed.
yeah, interesting idea, but
For sure.
yeah. So I'm going to go straight to my very last question then. If you were to write this book again, I'm not suggesting you do, but if you were to kind of start again, is there anything that you would add, or is there anything that you would change?
I mean, there's bits and pieces that I'd tweak here and there to make a bit clearer. So, for example, like the way that we model, way we explain stuff, going freehand. We've started calling, I think in the book I call it like live drawing, but I think we call it blank canvassing now, because I think that's a better phrase to use, because it indicates, any phrase that you use that indicates the thing you're trying to convey from within the phrase already is better. Mm-hmm. So like retrieval practice, because it's about retrieving, whereas, you know, assessment for learning, there's assessment, there's learning, but it's not 100%. Anyway, so blank canvassing, it like sends that message loud and clear. Start from a blank canvas. That's like the key. So stuff like that I would add. Obviously, I'd probably expand the question and answer section, because, you know, I'm fielding, you know, I'm always getting asked questions and stuff that I want to help with. And I'd make that section bigger, but like nothing's changed radically since I published the book. And I'm sort of at the phase now of my teaching where I'm not trying a lot of new ideas. I'm just trying to get the good stuff pat always. And I think, so I wouldn't want to really add too much. And I don't think there's anything in there, in my opinion, that is superfluous or a marginal gain.
Yeah. I think part of that's really down to the planning and making the terms specific to what you mean, using the evidence to move forward. And I think, you know, that's probably why we've got a finished product that, you know, should have some longevity there. It should hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And I hope that there's enough in there that means there's a lot of change fatigue in schools. Yeah. And part of it is because part of it's been driven by the NPQ culture, which is where everybody was expected to do a project and implement something, and you'd have a different assistant head standing up at the front of staff meeting every term saying, this term we're implementing this term we're implementing that, or whatever. And I'd much rather just like people could chill out and just say, okay, this is something that I'm going to just like work on over many months and many years, as opposed to just do in a lesson. And I was at a conference last week where there were a whole bunch of sessions that were like how to teach X, and it was like something like super specific. And I was like, on the one hand, for some teachers, I'm sure that is useful, but it's maybe only useful once a year. I'd rather be giving people something that they could use every day. And I think, that's why I'm hoping it's got legs, and hopefully I won't need to do any more work on it for a long time.
So certainly seems that way to me. Right, let's get this draw done. So let me attempt to share our little name generator. Fingers crossed.
Oh, is it like a drum roll?
Here's a bit where I can never find it.
It's no pressure. Oh, there we go.
Are we there?
Look at that.
Fabulous. Okay, so let's see how this works. That'd be good. How do I go? Press go. Go.
I don't know. Oh no, there's a fourth. There's a fourth.
How does it spin?
I don't know.
Oh, I just click it. Oh, did we miss one? Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Fabulous. So, Rachel Hunter, if you would like to DM us at Chat Physics on Twitter, we will take your information from you and we'll get one of Adam's books, a copy of Adam's books posted to you. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to Paula, who's just jumped in there at the end. I'm so sorry I missed that one. Join us next time. We're going to have, hopefully, plenty more of these. So, Adam, first of all, thank you so much. for coming today. It's been absolutely
My pleasure.
brilliant talking to you and, you know, sort of like going through some of those ideas in a bit more detail. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really hope that everybody at home has, everybody who's watching has really gained something there. If you do have any questions, we are both on Twitter at ChatPhysics and at AdamBoxer1. So please do feel free to bug Adam there. I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. If you don't already have a copy of the book and you haven't won one today, I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for watching. That's bye from me and bye to Adam. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Have a good one.
Thank you.